Hello, welcome. Good to see you all here tonight. We want to start with a land acknowledgement. So I want to introduce Jim Bear Jacobs. He's the co-director of racial justice for the Minnesota Council of Churches.
In just a few seconds, I'm going to greet you by saying good evening. And then, because the majority of us in here are stoic Minnesotans, about 3 of you will return the good evening while the rest sit in silence. I will then offer some lame attempt at a joke about stoic Minnesotans and saying we could do better than that, and then I will say good evening again, and then all of you will come in and say good evening. And I just want to take this moment to encourage us to push past that awkwardness and just come in full gusto. Good evening.
Good evening. Woo.
My name is Jim Bear Jacobs. I am the co-director for racial justice for the Minnesota Council of Churches. I am from the Turtle Clan, and I'm a citizen of the Stockbridge-Muncie Band of Mohican Indians, for whom our ancestral homelands are the Hudson River Valley from Manhattan Island to Lake Champlain in upstate New York. However, our contemporary homelands are about 256 miles straight east of here in the middle of Shawano County, Wisconsin. And I'm here to offer a land acknowledgement. But first, a few words about what a land acknowledgement is, or more importantly, about what a land acknowledgement is not. A land acknowledgement is not action. A land acknowledgement is not justice. Rather, what a land acknowledgement is the first tiny step that can lead to action and hopefully lead to justice. When one imagines the concept of home, some of the qualities that can come to mind are safety and security in the immediate moment and a generational stability for the future. Our program today will deal with this idea of home. Specifically, some of the systemic and intentional ways that those comforting aspects of safety, security, and stability are removed from home for a select group of individuals. We know that Minnesota was a home for peoples long before statehood in the 19th century, and even longer before European eyes first beheld our beautiful forests, lakes, and rivers in the 17th century. Across the millennia, a number of indigenous people have called what is now Minnesota home. The Anishinaabe and the Ho-Chunk have for times and season called this land home. But it is for Dakota that this land has always and forever will be home. Tonight, we are gathered in the ancestral and contemporary homelands of the Dakota people. We are just a few miles downriver from where we are right now will bring you to the sacred Bedote, the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, the very center of the Dakota universe. Let us look to and learn from our Dakota relatives about how to live in a relationship of harmony with this sacred Mini Sota Makoche. As we listen to our panelists guide us through particular histories and narratives about how some have limited access to others' ability to call this beautiful land home, let us be mindful how those same mindsets and attitudes are still active today. And let us commit ourselves to stand resolute in the face of any oppressive, fragile power that threatens those vulnerable among us from feeling that comfort of home. Let us resolve ourselves to these things so that we can be people of integrity when we look to our neighbors, to our relatives, and say, welcome home.
Jim, thank you so much for that. Really appreciate that. It's a really lovely way to start this, this evening's discussion. Hello, my name is Kendall Harkness. I am head of culture and community at the Star Tribune. And let's continue where Jim left off and talk about place. We are at Sabathoni, which is about a mile from where George Floyd died. We are also right by 35W, which divides us, one community from another. And we have racial covenants in the South. And so we think about place, we also think about time. We're only a few days from the 5th anniversary. The news has been the news, right? We are dealing with some heavy things. And I wanted to give, before we get started, I really wanted to give us space and time to sort of process that heaviness, to be ready for it. When we talk about race, it is hard work. So be mindful of yourself and how you're feeling throughout the evening. If you need to get up, get up. If you need a moment, you need a moment. So be mindful of your heart throughout this process. I think that is important. Secondly, I wanted to say, I wanted to ask you guys to think about what brought you here this evening. You all came, bought tickets online, knew people who came, brought people with you. Why did you decide that this was important to show up for? I want you to think about that. I want you to turn to your neighbor, and then I want you guys to talk about why you decided to come. All right, so I'm gonna give you a little minute. You guys have a conversation. I know we're in Minnesota, but it's time to be in community. Let's do this.
Good to see you. No, it's true. It's true.
Some stereotypes are baked in truth.
Well, it would be.
All right.
Professional.
Look at you guys talking to each other.
Whole big scanners for that.
Amazing. All right, let's get back. Let's come back. So anytime we have these events, like I just think that it is important. You are with your neighbors. You are with your community. You should talk to one another. And so like I always try to make sure that we have space for that. We learn when we are in community and talking. We have understanding. We become familiar with things that we just didn't know or didn't understand. And so by way of taking the time and talking to a stranger, I mean, journalists do this all the time, so it's a sort of a occupational hazard or whatever you want to call it. So it's good practice. And so I'm grateful for you guys having that conversation with each other. So I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to invite Melissa Townsend, who is our senior audio producer, up, and then we're going to get this party started. All right, thank you.
Hello again. I'm just going to adjust this for a second. We're here tonight to tell a story about this place, Minneapolis. That story reaches back more than 100 years, and it shows us key moments in the long history that brought us here. This history is laid out in the podcast, Ghost of a Chance. How many of you have heard the podcast? Oh, there we go. Thank you very much. My kids are here. They've heard it. The main characters in the podcast are Harry and Clementine Robinson and Eric Roper, who moved into their house and wanted to find out everything about them. You'll hear more about them as we move through this evening. In the retelling of this history tonight, you're going to hear some very heavy things. There is out-of-date language. There are stories of racial violence of many different forms. This is an important time to be telling this story. Books are being pulled off the shelves. Voices are being silenced. The journalists and historians on this stage want to make sure that the true stories of people like Harry and Clementine Robinson are not lost, because they help us understand what happened to George Floyd 5 years ago, and they help us to understand what's happening today. We have created this event to feel like a live taping of a podcast episode, and I'm going to be honest with you, it's a little bit of an experiment. Thank you for joining. There is recorded sound, there are images on the screen, but it's also a live conversation among all of us up here and with you out there. I want to introduce the people on the stage. You may recognize them from the podcast. Greg McMore, community historian, born and raised right here in the Old South Side neighborhood. He played clarinet on this stage during middle school. I love telling that story. Eric Roper is the Metro columnist at the Minnesota Star Tribune. Kirsten Delegard is a historian and co-founder and project director of Mapping Prejudice at the University of Minnesota Libraries. Uhuru Williams, distinguished university chair, professor, and founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas. And Greg D'Onofrio. He teaches historic preservation and public history in the School of Architecture, and he is an associate dean of faculty and academic affairs in the College of Design at the University of Minnesota. Let's give them a round of applause. All right, let's get started.
In 1917, Harry and Clementine Robinson moved into a modest three-bedroom house in the Kingfield neighborhood in South Minneapolis. It was in an all-white area. They were black.
When I look at the pictures and I watch how they present themselves in those pictures, strong people, chin up, resilient, and proud of who they are.
And that house the Robinsons moved into back in 1917, I live there now. I climb the same stairs. I sleep in the same bedroom. And when I found that out, I got really curious. What happened to them? The podcast Ghost of a Chance is about my search to uncover what happened to Harry and Clementine Robinson. Greg, Kirsten, Uhuru, and Greg helped me find out.
And as they uncovered the Robinson story, they realized that the Robinsons reveal a history of the black community in South Minneapolis that Eric and many of us had never heard before.
The Robinsons bought their house in South Minneapolis at a critical moment. When they buy their house, the city is actually racially integrated, but that's about to change. And this is going to create profound barriers for the Robinsons and generations of people to follow.
They became part of a thriving black middle class that was developing itself in Minneapolis, and city and state leaders made decisions that harmed those communities in their homes and their businesses.
And tonight, we mark the 5th anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, and you can't fully understand what happened to George Floyd unless you understand what happened to Harry and Clementine Robinson.
Their story reveals a history of race right here in this city.
They say history doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes. And tonight, we explore the echoes of racial justice here in this place and how they shape our current moment.
We start with a story about early migrants to Minneapolis and what they found when they arrived. In the 1800s, people came from all over the world to the lands of the Dakota and the Anishinaabe.
First, the French and the British are coming to Minnesota, then Swedes, Germans, Norwegians, Finns, and others came. And then there were also African Americans before and after the Civil War.
You can learn a lot about mainstream opinions in the city from editorials in the newspapers at the time. Eric found a number of pieces in the papers that illustrate the way white, powerful Minneapolitans felt toward these newly arrived black citizens.
All these editorials were written by the leadership of the Minneapolis Tribune and the Minneapolis Journal, and these are mainstream newspapers at the time. And there are a few editorials that acknowledge that discrimination and the sense of white superiority is as rampant in the North as it was in the South. And here's this example in an editorial from 1901 from the Minneapolis Journal, and this clip is read by Star Tribune staffer David Tainter.
As far as the Journal is concerned, it has never hesitated to admit that there is no love wasted on the Negro in any part of the North.
There are also several editorials that say that black citizens were more suited to the South than the North, and you can hear that in this piece from 1902.
The southern states are the best habitat for the Negroes. The climate is better adapted to them. The southern people, of the better and ruling sort, have less personal prejudice against the Negroes than the northern whites. They understand them better and, aside from their determination not to allow them to vote, are apt to deal with them more fairly.
We all take a breath here. Seemingly, the feeling among powerful white Minneapolitans was that they did not want a bigger black community in the city. But black families did come.
Harry and Clementine moved here in 1908, and after a brief stay in St. Paul, they moved to Duluth and then to South Minneapolis.
Uhuru Williams, you told us that when black migrants did move to the city, they received instructions on how to behave. Tell us more about that.
There was an emphasis on the politics of respectability, and you had both the pressures that are created by the white community, kind of imposing its norms and values on black people. And then you also had efforts by black organizations, civic organizations, to try to guide or to help black families navigate that prejudice. I draw your attention to this flyer from Detroit Urban League from 1918, and I think part of the problem here is that these helpful hints often hurt black people by crystallizing some of the worst stereotypes about black people. And they were really about making the white community comfortable, less about helping black people become acclimated to their new urban neighborhoods. I draw your attention to one in particular, the final one here. Don't go about making lots of noise going to and from baseball games. If the parks are taken away from you, it will partly be your own fault.
Greg McMore's ancestors arrived here during the Civil War around 1864. Greg, tell us about the story of them coming to Minnesota and then settling in Minneapolis.
Yes, though my third generation grandfather, John Wallace, was born in South Carolina, he was enslaved in Virginia. He killed the overseer in Virginia to get off the land. And on his way here, he connected with the Minnesota's 3rd Regiment coming back from the East Coast, coming back from the Civil War. He eventually settled in Hastings, Minnesota, where he started the AME Church, Brown's Chapel AME Church. My grandmother is one of the babies there in the front row, I believe, yeah. Shortly after that, in the beginning of the 1900s, Brown's Chapel AME Church, which was home for about 30 African Americans, was destroyed by fire. 2 white citizens from Hastings broke into the back of the church, spread gas everywhere, and burned it up, completely destroyed it. When I'm speaking in Hastings and elsewhere, I often ask the question, can you imagine what my family and all the folks down in Hastings, the black folks, were thinking in that October evening when they were all around the table having dinner? Well, I have a lot of their values, obviously, my family's values, so I'll tell you about that in a whole nother time, what the conversation was probably like. By 1912, my grandmother had moved to South Minneapolis, 416 East 25th Street. And that particular picture is the other side of my family, my mother's side, who migrated up to Canada from Kentucky and Kansas, and then came back down to over to Winnipeg and then to Minneapolis. So, you know, when I talk about this, I'm talking about a group of people who practiced resilience. And still to this very day, we have to continue to practice resilience. In the early 1900s, St. Peter's AME Church, our first church was in St. Anthony, over by the Minneapolis Post Office, across the river from there. That church was destroyed by fire. Suspicious means, again. Practicing resilience, the membership at that time moved the church, had fundraisers, and opened up our second church over on 22nd and Elliott, St. Peter's AME Church. By 1948, 49, that church was destroyed by fire. So this was a constant thing, and I stop and think about my grandmother, and all of the churches, all the AME churches, they were all destroyed by fire. Mm-hmm. We held services up here at when it was Bryan Junior High School, and as our other church down on 41st and 4th Avenue was being built. And that's where I was baptized, actually, in 1953, I guess. So we're Southsiders. Always have been. Don't plan on going any place, my wife and I, so.
Tell us about the old South Side, Greg. Your family settled here, and this is where you live now.
You know, we've always been here. We're Minnesotans, and feel good about being Minnesotans. African American, Black Minnesotans. We have family members that came down from Fergus Falls, from Duluth, all over, and we always came and settled here in South Minneapolis. Worked here. My father was one of the first African Americans to teach in the Minneapolis public school system. So we have a long history in Minneapolis. My next generation, my daughter and her husband live right across the freeway, all right? So that's a little bit about my family's history.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Greg D'Onofrio has worked with Greg and others to document the history of this community, the Old South Side. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about it, Greg.
Well, I wanted to situate us geographically. The Old South Side is located between 34th and 46th Streets from north to south, and from Nicollet Avenue to Chicago Avenue from west to east. Tonight, here at Sabathoni, we're located at what was the center of the South Side at East 38th and 4th Avenue, which was so important to the African American community that some elders still refer to it as the corner.
Greg McMore's story of moving from other places around Minneapolis into this neighborhood, it's the same story of many Black families in Minneapolis. Kirsten, you have spent decades learning about this. How was the urban landscape changing in the early 1900s?
Well, right around the time that the Robinsons bought their house, which is now Eric's house, there's a new preoccupation with making American cities livable. So there's some really good things that come out of this. We get more investment in green spaces, parks, municipal garbage collection. But there's some sinister developments as well. This campaign to remake urban space is saturated with what we now call scientific racism. And as part of that, it became accepted wisdom that racially mixed neighborhoods were dangerous and bad for property values. And that's where the thing that my team studies, the Mapping Prejudice team, enters the story, racial covenants. These are clauses that were inserted into property records that to prevent people who are not white from buying or even occupying certain pieces of land. And the first racial covenant here in Minneapolis appears in 1910. And over the 30 years that followed, these racist deeds spread throughout the city, and they reserved huge swaths of the city just for white people. And as these covenants spread, then the urban landscape really changed. Neighborhoods came to be seen as black or white. And it's at this moment that the South Side, the old South Side, the corner, really emerges as a black neighborhood, as a neighborhood that's seen as black.
Greg D'Onofrio, you've spent a lot of time talking with people who grew up in the Old South Side, like Greg McMorrow. Tell us more about what you've heard from them.
Well, the Old South Side began to take shape as an integrated neighborhood in the 1930s, when it became a really rare part of the city where middle-class black people started businesses, were able to buy houses, created important institutions, some of which continue today. Black people were pushed and pulled into this neighborhood as a result of intimidation and violence, real estate discrimination, and tools of racial exclusion like covenants and redlining that Kirsten just mentioned. It became a bastion of home ownership for the black community because it was arguably the only middle-class neighborhood in Minneapolis where African Americans could buy homes, where they also had access to nice parks, good schools, and a commercial district with black-owned businesses and institutions. But decisions made by city and state leaders harm Southside homeowners and businesses. The routing of 35W through South Minneapolis in the late 1950s provides a really vivid example of this. Freeway planners picked a location along 2nd and Stevens Avenues that they knew was an informal racial dividing line. Most African Americans had lived to the east. To the west was almost entirely white. 35W created a concrete barrier to racial integration. What's more, local leaders knew that Twin Cities freeway construction was creating a housing crisis for African Americans. In the late 50s and early 60s, it was legal to discriminate in the sale and rental of housing on the basis of race. It was legal and it was widespread. And as a result, white and black families who were displaced from the South Side by construction of 35W had very different fates. With all but 2 exceptions, black families relocated less than a mile from where they had been living to other locations in the South Side. White families moved wherever they wanted, the vast majority of them to the suburban neighborhoods that were over 99% white. The African American commercial district along 38th and 4th, right here, began a slow decline shortly after 35W was completed in 1968. The African American home ownership rate also began to fall as more housing became occupied by renters.
I think those words you speak, black residents of Minneapolis were pushed and pulled, is really the dynamic that I hear through this whole story. This is our history. We live here. We live in Minnesota. We live in Minneapolis. It's the history that we inherited, whether we wanted it or not. This is what came before us. And as Uhuru said in the beginning, the history doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes. And you can hear the early 1900s echoing as you fast forward to the 1980s. There was another big migration of black families to Minneapolis. Just like in the early 1900s, they brought their hopes and dreams, their wishes and their joys with them. This is Edith Washington. She moved to Minneapolis from Gary, Indiana in the 1980s. She was profiled in a Star Tribune story that ran in 1993. This is what it said. Life looked bleak in Gary, Indiana for Edith Washington. She had 3 children, about $350 a month in welfare, and an ex-boyfriend out to beat her up. Then 2 years ago, she took a Greyhound bus to Minneapolis to start a new life. It goes on to say that her family helped her, and she discovered a childhood learning center near her apartment and enrolled her children. Then she discovered a neighborhood job training center and eventually enrolled in classes at a technical college. At the time of the story, she was about to graduate as a qualified electrician. She was going to move into a suburban HUD home that she had rented for 2 years, that she would rent for 2 years and then assume the mortgage. The story quotes her as saying, "Minnesota has been good for me. Ever since I've come here, my life has been great. There's been struggling, it's been hard, but I've been doing it." Now, we hear from Edith Washington here, and she is a success story. But Uhuru, you've looked closely at this period of time in Minneapolis history, And when people around the region talked about newcomers from Gary and Chicago who were black, they did not talk about Edith Washington.
Not at all. In fact, their descriptions of them would have sounded more like the way that some people choose to remember George Floyd. When Derek Chauvin was convicted, Mayor Fry went out on social media and made a statement in which he said, George Floyd came to Minnesota to better his life, Minneapolis, but ultimately our community will have been bettered because of his sacrifice. And that is a telling statement because it projects what Minnesotans want to believe about themselves, that this is a space of transformation and opportunity. But the reality is that the echoes of what we saw in 1918 still exist for black people who are coming from, as part of the Second Great Migration, from Gary, Indiana. They're criminalized. They are associated with criminality, with gangs, and there are efforts to restrict their movements. Edith's story is a story of success, but for the vast majority of African Americans entering into Minnesota in this period, particularly from Gary, Indiana becomes synonymous with criminality. And the response from the police and from institutions is less of what Edith got and more like what we saw at 38th and Chicago in terms of the violence visited on George Floyd's body, which began long before the police showed up on that evening.
Greg McMore, you were living here in the old Southside Black community in the 80s and 90s. And I've heard you talk about the neighborhood changing. What do you remember about what was happening at that time?
You know, I was living and working in Washington, D.C., and my work at the time was in community corrections and criminal justice. I worked with a lot of fellows that were incarcerated and their transition. I did that work in Washington, in D.C. as well. And one evening I was watching the news. It was Jim Vance. And he referred to my home, to Minneapolis, as Murderapolis. My home. And shortly thereafter, I made the decision to come back home. And when I moved into my home, which was my family's home since the 1940s, I was the only one on the block that owned a home and was living there. Everything else was vacant. It had a whole different feel to it because back in the day, you know, we had 13 businesses up and down 38th Street. We talk about the corner, it was alive with Mr. Crown's record store, and there was a bank there. You know, we used to run over from here over to 38th Street and 4th Avenue and watch the Minneapolis Central track team and everybody warming up by running down the street. I mean, it was alive. There was vitality here. And then shortly thereafter, obviously, the demise of my neighborhood took place. You know, I remember having guns stuck in my face. I remember racial profiling by a police when he stuck a .350 Magnum upside my head. The whole feeling in my home was different. And I want you to keep in mind, my mentors were influential people, you know, back in the day. And to come into this community and deal with us, or try to deal with us, that was a no-no because our leaders lived here. So it's on a rebound. It's on a rebound. And somewhere down the road, you all will be hearing about a group of us that are taking on, honoring the old neighborhood right over here on 38th Street and 4th Avenue, and with a site. Just kind of saying, yeah, we were here and we're coming back.
So there are different narratives about what happened in this neighborhood. It's certainly shifted. And there was a vilification and a criminalization of the people who lived here. But Greg D'Onofrio, you have in your studies looked at some other reasons why this neighborhood was changing. Can you talk about that?
I talked to a lot of Southsiders as part of a project called Human Tolls, a public history of 35W. And one of them was artist Setu Jones, who spent his childhood on the South Side here. He told me that it was a physically and socially cohesive neighborhood. Those were his words before the freeway. And he talked about there having been a network of mothers who kept a watchful eye over him and his friends. Other African American elders told me that, me and my colleagues, that they felt very safe on the South Side. They felt a sense of belonging here. One refrain I heard repeatedly was that everything we needed was right here in terms of businesses and churches and places to socialize. So how does the freeway change one's sense of belonging? How does it disrupt the network of watchful mothers? Well, one insight was shared with me by Mr. Lewis Moore, who explained that Nicollet Field had long been a popular community gathering place. We know it now as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Park. Mr. Moore said he and his friends of all different races played sports there, and their parents came there too for picnics. Black and white parents, he emphasized. Minneapolis didn't have many places that promoted and supported social activity among people of different races, places where black and white people got to know one another and become friends. When the freeway was built, Nicollet Field was all of a sudden on the wider west side of the freeway. It was harder to get to for black kids and their families. And those stores on the east side of the freeway on 38th and 4th Avenue, they were harder to get to for people living on the west side. The freeway just made it easier to go to new shopping opportunities in the suburbs. So the freeway made the South Side suddenly less physically cohesive, and gradually it became less socially cohesive. And when that happened, people said they felt less safe. They felt a less sense of belonging here.
So the freeway segregated the neighborhood, destroyed the social cohesion, and hurt the black-owned businesses. Yohuru, what else was going on in the larger context while that was happening in the Old South Side?
Well, this coincides nationally with the crack epidemic, the war on drugs, and the rise of violent gangs, and the violent over-policing of black and brown neighborhoods nationally. Black migrants are vilified in this, but it's also important to note that this is also the consequence of hollowed-out neighborhoods, the politics of abandonment, and the reminder that policies kill.
All of this was blamed on black newcomers coming from Gary and Chicago. The larger context was lost in a lot of community reflection, when in reality, that stage was set for the change starting decades earlier with decisions made by city and state leaders regarding housing and the freeway. This all makes me think back to one of the editorials that Eric found from 1916 that seems to sow doubt about black migrants heading north, just like the doubt that was sown in the 1980s.
The Negro expects in the North that he will be able to give his children better schooling and his family a better living standard. This is far from true of all the immigrants. There is reason to believe many of those who come north have deliberately abandoned their families.
Let's take a breath. Yohuru, do you want to share a reflection about this?
It's the worst impulse to assume pathology in the black community. When people, and I realize that some people don't like Al Sharpton, but when Al Sharpton delivered the eulogy for George Floyd, and he said, George Floyd's story has been the story of black folks. That's how come we could never be what we wanted to be, because you had your knee on our neck. We could do well in school. We didn't have to hustle in the streets. We had businesses, so and so, but you had your knee on our neck. That's the echo for the black community. It's editorials like 1916. It's the helpful hints to Detroit migrants. It's the criminalization of black and brown bodies. And it's ultimately what you see here, the soft bigotry of low expectations, which are buttressed by the hard reality of police power and policies like residential segregation, what I call the 6 degrees of segregation: housing, education, denial of access to places of public accommodation, unfair labor practices, and the most visible and intractable of those 6 degrees, Jim Crow justice, which reinforces or enforces all the others. Even Harry and Clementine find themselves in the grips of that system, and they were the models of respectability.
It is the echo that we hear of 1901, 1902, 1916, the 1980s, and of course, in 2020. Let's talk more about the media and the police. In the early 1900s, most of the jobs available for Black residents were strictly limited. You might remember from the podcast, if you heard it, that when Eric learned this, he was surprised. This is from the podcast.
So with the jobs that they could have, you see waiters, porters, barbers, janitors, elevator operators. These are mostly jobs in service. Occasionally you'll see someone works for like the post office, but very limiting of what you could do.
When Eric looked, he found that Harry Robinson was a star student in high school, and his future looked very bright.
Right, so Harry earned a scholarship to a law school in Indiana after he was valedictorian, and this scholarship was then taken away from him when they found out that he was Black. And it was quickly after that he turned to being a waiter. And so for more than 20 years, Harry Robinson was a waiter or a cook, until one day he managed to open up a restaurant, and it was called Little Dixie Chicken Shack, right near Lyndale Avenue and Lake Street. And it was an all-night place, open from dusk until dawn.
And then one night in February 1926, Harry Robinson was most likely cooking away in his chicken shack. And what happened next?
So a man named Roy Mattis came into the restaurant, and there was some kind of altercation, and we really don't know what or why, but we know that according to the news reports, Harry Robinson shot Roy Mattis in the neck, and Roy lived, but this whole thing was written up in the Minneapolis Star and the Minneapolis Tribune newspapers at the time.
And Eric found those two reports had a lot of problems. So in the podcast, Eric went to Kirsten to ask her, what does she make of all of this? Here's their discussion.
We have his race is in the headline. He's identified as a cook. He's not charged. There's no follow-up story. So if you're Harry, it's kind of throwing you under the bus in a sense, especially.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if Black people are almost only in the newspaper when they commit crimes, and they're always identified by race. Those articles show that the reporter was just basically taking verbatim whatever the police told him.
Right, to the point where the address is wrong in the same way in both. And his name is also spelled wrong with two B's in both. So they took something verbatim from the police records.
Without questioning or talking to anyone.
Yeah, just used it straight up.
Without a full and accurate record of what happened, Eric did his best to figure out what might have happened in the chicken shack that night.
Yeah, I mean, when the police report is wrong and then the newspaper of record is parroting that and is wrong, it's extremely difficult to go back and figure out what really happened.
And that shooting was the beginning of the end for Harry Robinson's livelihood. Let's fast forward to another police report from the Minneapolis Police Department. This is from 2020.
Two officers arrived and located the suspect, a male believed to be in his 40s, in his car. He was ordered to step from his car. After he got out, he physically resisted officers. Officers were able to get the suspect into handcuffs and noted he appeared to be suffering medical distress. Officers called for an ambulance. He was transported to Hennepin County Medical Center by ambulance, where he died a short time later.
That is the press release that supposedly described the death of George Floyd. Many media outlets draw from police press releases without question. Uhuru, could you talk about how this relates to the distrust of the police in communities of color?
This is one of the reasons why that mistrust runs so deep, is that this has typically been the experience of Black people. You saw it in that account of Harry shooting Roy Mattis with the assumption that Robinson, who's the proprietor, the owner, is identified as merely a cook who involved Mattis in a dispute. The facts themselves indict Harry, who, for all we know, was likely the victim in that encounter. The reality for Black people in America today is that if not for Darnella Frazier's cell phone video, that account of the murder of George Floyd likely would have gone down like so many other accounts, like the one that we just saw about Harry Robinson, that leave Black people to ultimately bear responsibility often for encounters that look very different if people were exposed to the facts as opposed to the interpretation of officers who bring their own bias and the fear of Black people to those encounters.
Thank you. Part 3, imperfect victims and erasure. When Eric began to learn more about Harry and Clementine Robinson, he found out that in November of 1915, they had just moved to Minneapolis. They were living in an apartment on the south side of the city, and it seemed like it was a pretty hard time for the couple. You might remember from the podcast that Clementine filed for divorce from Harry Robinson.
And in her divorce filing, Clementine described in detail the physical abuse that she was suffering at the hands of her husband, Harry. And she described him as, quote, a user of intoxicating liquors to excess. And Melissa read this part of the filing in the podcast.
She says, he has spent all of his evenings away from home, drinking and gambling, at which he has spent and lost his money. And but for her work and efforts, said parties would have had no home to live in, nor any money with which to pay rent and buy clothes and provisions.
So I was very shaken when I read this. I remember being at Hennepin County Courthouse and having a very physical reaction to it, and then it sort of, with the next week, I was still sort of reacting to it. When you research someone, you sort of, and in my case, I have been sort of rooting for Harry. And then after reading this, I started really asking myself about, who is Harry really? What more do I know about him?
So we called Dion Trice. She's here tonight. Hello, Dion. She's a marriage and family therapist at the Family Development Center in St. Paul. Dion is a therapist who has a particular expertise with domestic violence. And after I told her about Harry Robinson's life, this is what she said.
One of the ways that we would explain their cycle to the men is we would use a jack-in-a-box. A jack-in-a-box, you get 15 cranks before it pops open, right? But when you have poverty, abandonment, social stressors, injustices, trauma that are unresolved and undealt with, that's like taking a crank away every day. So then, of course, when I'm walking and I come home and I'm with my family, all the other daily things that get added makes it far easier for me to lose it.
I really struggled with this. I think when you're researching someone, it's easy to sort of come up with an idea of them in your head. And this was when I started to realize that Harry's more complicated than I understood. And he went from being an idea to me to being a really full-fledged human. I mean, after that week of really being, frankly, just really sad about finding this, I started to realize that the experiences that I was documenting about Harry's life, the jobs, the scholarship, what have you, these are real things that do take a toll on a person, do start to shape a person. And so I think that it drew me a lot deeper into Harry's story ultimately. And so, yeah.
Eric and I recognize the conditions that made his life so incredibly difficult. Earning a law school scholarship, a game changer for a young Black boy in 1900, only to have the school revoke that offer because of the color of his skin. It was an act that changed the course of his life. We know that kind of racial trauma sticks with you. Greg McMore, you've told us that there's been racial trauma that sticks with you even today. Tell us about that.
Yeah, trauma. It's not just from today. I've told you a little bit of my family history. Here, before coming to Minnesota, the stories, and then guns are stuck in my face in my neighborhood by the police. Imagine all of that constantly from one generation to another generation in my family. It's trauma. I think about it an awful lot. And some of that happened back in the 1980s.
Uhuru, we're talking about the way racial trauma takes a toll on Harry Robinson, on Greg, and I wonder if you can talk about the connection you see with George Floyd.
I think Dion described it so beautifully when she talked about those cranks and the ways in which society, and I'll just talk about black men for just a second, emasculates black men. We think about Harry, who has the scholarship, and in a society which is sexist and misogynistic and patriarchal, denies him the opportunity to be head of household, and how emasculating that must have been for him. And then we also think about Clementine, who, if we think about a document like Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, where Dr. King says, "My wife will never be given the distinguished title of Mrs." So you're in a society which sets standards and norms which are hopelessly unattainable, not because of your lack of hard work, but because of the cranks that Dion described so beautifully. And for me, they all come together in one of the most overlooked witnesses at the Floyd trial, and that's Alicia Euler, the young woman who was working at the service station across from the Cup Food. And the reason she's such a powerful witness is when she was testifying, people were kind of skewering her on social media because of her inability to speak the Queen's English, so to speak. But what she shared was really powerful. She dropped out of high school in the 11th grade. She's doing irregular shift work at the Cup Food, and she tells the lawyer at that time, and of all the things, and she says, and I'm quoting her, I'm trying not to cuss, that people deal with at 38th in Chicago is when the police come messing with people. That's the tip of the spear, but the reality is the cranks that exist, the high grocery prices, the over-policing, the not being seen or heard in the way that we see women and people of color line up on that sidewalk to plead for George Floyd's life and to be completely ignored by the system. It is a powerful metaphor for what Harry experienced, what Greg describes, and which communities of color, Black and Indigenous people in this community and beyond, know intimately.
As we draw a connection from Harry Robinson to George Floyd, I wanted to bring up something from another newspaper story. Back in 2020, Star Tribune reporter Maya Rao wrote a long article about George Floyd's life before and after he moved to Minneapolis. She wrote that in June of 2018, his mother died, and he took it hard. A friend of his was quoted as saying, "He lost what kept him centered." Here's what Maya reported after he lost his mother.
He spent more time alone in his room when he returned to Minneapolis, not wanting to burden others with his anguish. But death became a grim chorus in Floyd's life as news kept coming about the shootings of old neighbors and friends in Houston.
George Floyd was dating a woman named Courtney Ross at the time, and Maya spoke with her for the article.
Ross had seen Floyd disappear for days when his roommate Eric Cornley died. Now, when she saw him withdraw, she learned to ask, "Did you lose somebody? What's going on? You can't just shut down." Ross?
And after he was murdered by police officer Derek Chauvin, his human struggles were weaponized against him. He was on the ground under Derek Chauvin's knee for nearly 10 minutes, calling out for help. We saw that. But because of his drug use, some people have blamed George Floyd for his own death. Kirsten, you've talked about this before.
Yeah. Well, I just want to start by saying, is there anyone here tonight who doesn't have faults? You know, I know for myself, I know I'm deeply flawed. I know that we're all human and that we all deserve justice. And I guess in the spirit of this reveal, I'll confess that I'm feeling really discouraged right at this moment, even though I'm in a room with all of you, because I'm distressed at what I see as a toxic attachment to white supremacy. So 5 years ago, millions of people around the world took to the streets to protest racial injustice. And scholars have described this as the largest social movement in world history. And I drew so much inspiration from those demonstrations. There's so many good people. Yet, at the same time, there's so many people who find it easier to fixate on the struggle of one human who's trying to get through this thing called life than to confront structural racism and police violence. For evidence of this, I would direct you to read the comments left by Star Tribune readers on the story announcing this event tonight. But you can't, because those ugly comments have now been hidden. But they were definitely revealing, right? So for me, I am going to mark this 5th anniversary by stating something for the historical record, for future historians. Mr. George Floyd was murdered. He did not die from a drug overdose. He was asphyxiated. His breathing was cut off by Derek Chauvin's knee. In his last moments of life, he wasn't allowed to breathe freely because he was seen as a threat rather than a human who was experiencing a medical emergency. So here's the bigger point. Even before that terrible moment at 38th and Chicago, Mr. George Floyd was not able to breathe freely in Minneapolis. And when I say breathe, I don't just mean the act of bringing air into your lungs. Let's all breathe. I mean George Floyd's ability to thrive in this place. Like Harry Robinson, he came to Minneapolis in search of opportunities. And like Harry Robinson, his race limited those opportunities. So we're out talking about this all the time, my team, Mapping Prejudice, and many Americans do not want to hear this today, but this is a thread that runs through our nation's history. Langston Hughes described it in a poem about Chicago that was published in 1949. He wrote, you can see it up here, "They've got covenants restricting me, hemmed in on the south side, can't breathe free." George Floyd echoed these lines as he lay dying at 38th in Chicago. "Please, please, please, I can't breathe," he pleaded. Those were his last words, and they were chanted by protesters all over the world in 2020. So I'd like to ask all of us here, what's changed? Who can and cannot breathe in Minneapolis today?
We'll share thoughts together in a few minutes, but I want to take one last look back 100 years ago to 1925. There's one final echo we want to explore. Eric.
You may remember from the podcast, in 1925, W. Gertrude Brown gave a speech in St. Paul to a group of social workers. And she was the head of the Phil Sweetley Settlement House in North Minneapolis and a very influential member of the Black community. And so this is actor Regina Williams reading a part of her speech.
Unfortunately, wherever you find the Negro in large numbers, he is forced to be a problem because he is denied the opportunity to work and live and play as other folk. Although Minneapolis' colored population is less than 6,000, this is a 127% increase over 1910. And like other cities of its size, it has many problems.
She is pointing out that the problem is not the Black community. The problem are the conditions the Black community is trying to deal with, the barriers, the injustices, the white racism. And if it doesn't change, W. Gertrude Brown said this:
"If the population continues to increase at this rate, and attention is not given to some of the handicaps under which he labors and which prevents him from becoming the kind of citizen you would like him to be, we will continue to have problems, and I fear more serious ones."
Uhuru W. Gertrude Brown was almost prophetic in this speech. I know that you find her words powerful. Tell us about what resonates with you today, 100 years after she said these words, and 5 years after George Floyd died.
The power of the continuing resonance of the warning across time. How many times do we need to hear it? And from who do we need to hear it from? I think it's particularly powerful for me because W. Gertrude Brown in that moment as a Black woman was naming and articulating something that we're accustomed to seeing in the messaging of a Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King or a Malcolm X. And she's addressing a predominantly white audience and offering a stark appraisal of the situation, the problem in that moment. Maybe people were more comfortable hearing Gunnar Myrdal, the Swedish economist, talk about it when he said that racism in the United States is not a problem, or the issues that the Black community face are not a problem of the Black community. They're products of white racism, of exclusion, of a denial to see and to work towards solutions that make sense, that actually would ultimately make all of us safer. It's a recognition that clearly we do have problems as a community, but those problems are made worse. They're exacerbated by exclusivity, by racism. And it's also an opportunity for us to reflect in this moment in particular on the current assault on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. In our contemporary moment, an effort to roll back. This is the predictable pattern. 1967, Dr. King comes to University of Minnesota, St. Paul campus, and gives an address in which he talks about the white backlash. And what always sticks out with me about that speech is that Dr. King says to those in attendance, the danger is always this. He says, I believe that more people were opposed to the racist policing of Bull Connor, and they wanted that to end, than they were really interested in creating an opportunity for real equity and justice, jobs, housing for Black people. And once you got rid of Bull Connor in Birmingham, Alabama, mission accomplished. And our contemporary moment, if I were, permit me to quote Dr. King, I think more people were opposed to what they saw in Derek Chauvin, and were waiting for that moment to declare, as Mayor Frye and others did, Chauvin's in jail, and now we're on the other side. Where's our happy ending? Instead of, we're committed to doing the work.
Tonight we've heard a story about an unwelcoming place that has often tried to erase the experience of oppression and racism. We've talked about the trauma that has rained down on the Black community here. We've talked about imperfection, injustice, and we've talked about the power of grace. I want to ask you and open up the floor to Q&A. We're going to have microphones. Thoughts and reflections from what you heard tonight, and also thoughts about how we move forward. Just take a couple seconds to think about that. Kendall and Mary Jo are coming with microphones. You can pop your hand up if you want to say anything. Kendall, there's a hand up here. Yeah.
Question about the report, green space, white space. Is that an official part of mapping prejudice?
That green space, white space is a story map that was made by Rebecca Walker, who's one of our affiliated scholars. So we work with her, but she's not part of our core team.
Thank you.
But I would love to take credit for work because she's fantastic. I'm just being honest here. So.
My other question about that report is, it talks about the 20-acre park on the Upper Harbor Terminal, and very innocently says that this park is to the benefit of one group to the detriment of another group. And if you've read the whole report, it's very clear that that park is to the benefit of white people to the detriment of Black people, even though that park is in North Minneapolis, which has been designated as a opportunity zone and a promise zone.
Their thoughts, comments, questions, hopes, dreams?
This is said with love as a Star Tribune subscriber, but I'm just curious what the newspaper's relationship is with the police department. Has anything changed since 2020? Is there more skepticism or more due diligence? I'm just curious because it makes it appear, you know, you said we're not for that video. It very could have easily just oh, that's what the police said, let's believe it.
Great question. Eric, do you feel comfortable answering?
I can try, and then Kendall, you know some of this too, right?
I do.
Do you want
I
to
do a
start,
little
and
bit.
then I can?
The Star Tribune during that time, probably after the uprising, we came together, and there is a public safety committee that was formed through some of the public safety teams. We've done a lot of work around how we listen to scanners and what we take from it. Sort of a right to be forgotten piece too. So there are policies in place that group has put together that allow for more transparency and more backstops in terms of what we allow out into the public. Because as you know, like once it's on the internet, we can't take it back. So that mindfulness about what we are publishing, how it affects community, do we actually need mugshots on these stories? All of those things are being considered.
Anything to add?
Hello, thank you for, I really like this presentation. I think it's a creative way to kind of reissue A Ghost of a Chance to a public audience. I have a unique relationship with this whole thing right now because I'm actually a producer of a documentary film called The Lost Negroes of North America. And it's specifically footage of this neighborhood from 1945 to 55. So those images, actually I have film footage, and there's a very unique documentary film, like I said. It's actually going to be screening off Broadway toward the end of this summer. That's one thing. The second
I'm sorry,
thing.
can you tell everybody who you are, brother? I'm sorry, I just want to make sure everybody knows who you are in case they want to.
Well, my name is Ralph L. Crowder III, so that's my name. But the second thing is I'm the current president of the Neighborhood Association on the south end of the quote-unquote Old South Side. So I just want to affirm that these themes and these issues are very much here today, and disturbingly so in conversations like this. It's almost like we only need to acknowledge these issues because of death. I know that you did have a variety of different, kind of points that you touched, but this is like taking a breath. It's so real, and it has so much of an impact. Even an exhausting impact that would almost describe the lack of black representation in the audience. This is something very familiar to us, and I really get troubled at times when it takes death to actually move to acknowledge these things. Because I've seen this play out in a neighborhood association like it was 1917, and it's 2025. And those stories need to be affirmed too, because those are stories in life. They're not dealing with any death. They're publicly happening in our faces. And I think it's kind of convenient for us to kind of access those themes when there's a dead body on the ground. So I would encourage, thank you for doing this. Thank you for making a public kind of presentation. And I'm thankful for also the work to kind of establish a new sensibility around our collective memories to be re-engaged.
Thank you.
And Greg and I were at the Field Virginia Northrop meeting last night, and credit to Ralph, there were many people there telling stories about the history that I think was important to be sharing in that community. So anyway, I just wanted to shout that out. It was a pretty significant meeting to be at and to hear some of those stories last night. So I appreciate you doing that work.
And congratulations if you won the presidency there. I thought you were interim. It seems like you scratched the interim part of it off. Okay.
I'm a woman who was born and raised in whiteness, born in 1960, and I've been learning how much I need to resist the whiteness every single day because it keeps wanting to. I think you were saying, Kristen, like this addiction to white supremacy, and I have to resist it every day because it keeps wanting to come back and tell me everything's fine. So my question is, from the historians, have there been examples of where it wasn't necessary for someone to be killed in order for the backlash that we're seeing right now, which started, a couple years ago with silence? Do you know examples of where people have resisted the backlash and said, no, we're actually going to come together and we're going to stay together?
Well, I will just say, I don't think it's ever linear, right? It's a constant struggle. It's a constant process. And I do think that as a historian, I think it's really important for us to visit these moments in the past to see when people do come together and when they do organize. And it's also very easy to look back and say, did that really change anything? I believe that there are many moments of change and that we cannot be discouraged just because we don't achieve everything with one movement, knowing that that I would say that for me, I feel like my role is not to fix everything individually. It's just to make my contribution, to not put down the struggle, right? But to just do what I can. So, I mean, I defer to my colleagues to the left here, but I'm thinking about in the immediate aftermath of World War II here in Minneapolis. There was a tremendously huge coalition of anti-racist work that came out. There was a group of sociologists from Fisk University that came up to the city and ran this massive, they called it a self-study. And they went out into every organization across Minneapolis and had these institutions study their own racial practices and racial biases. And the reports from that study are truly amazing. That moment of self-searching, or soul-searching rather. And then again, of course, you have the backlash in the 1950s, the anti-communists, the pushback. There's another wave that builds in the early 60s, and Greg has really looked at that, looking at the history of fair housing here in Minnesota.
Thanks, Kirsten, for the prompt. I think that's a good example of, I'd mentioned that the fates of white families and black families who were displaced by 35W in South Minneapolis really diverged quite radically because at the time, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, there was no protection for that prevented discrimination on the basis of race in the rental and sale of housing. Political leaders and civil rights advocates recognized this was a problem. They worked on this for many years. Minnesota eventually passed a fair housing law in 1962 that became effective in 1963, and it was largely through the advocacy of people like Josie Johnson and Mr. Matt Little, who was a South Sider here, who organized black social clubs throughout the Twin Cities to march. Three marches took place simultaneously in North Minneapolis and Rondo and here in the South Side. And that law was passed. It wasn't a perfect law. It had many loopholes and restrictions that civil rights advocates continued to press for another 5 or 6 years to get closed through fair housing laws that were passed in Minneapolis and separately in St. Paul, and then eventually the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Now, of course, housing discrimination did not end with those laws, but some progress was made. And to Mr. Crowder's point, nobody died specifically to pass those laws. It was a lot of hard work over many years and a lot of coalition building.
I'm gonna, because my colleagues gave great answers, I'm gonna take this in a slightly different direction to underscore the point that Ralph made and a point that Kirsten made earlier. But Harry and Clementine died.
Yeah.
At the Guthrie Theater, there's a portrait of Lorraine Hansberry that's outside. And my favorite Lorraine Hansberry play is probably everyone's, which is Raisin in the Sun. And there's that incredible passage in Raisin in the Sun where Benita's boyfriend presses to the family, isn't there something wrong in the world where everything is dependent on the death of a man? Mm-hmm. Whether that happens in the street of Minneapolis under the knee of Derek Chauvin, or it's because the family has to wait for the father to pass because they're waiting on insurance money so that Benita can decide whether she's going to go to university or whether Andrew, that Mr. Younger is going to open a liquor store. Their entire dreams are predicated on the death of the father who worked his entire life and never got to breathe. I've been telling educators who can't really teach the truth anymore that sometimes it's easy to teach by proxy and comment by proximity. So I'll give another example from literature, and it comes from Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. And the opening passage in a novel where we never learn the name of the main character by deliberately from Ralph Ellison because he's making a point, begins, I'm invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you see sometimes in a circus sideshow, as though I've been distorted by a hard, distorting glass. When they see me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything or anything but me. So I walk softly so as not to awake the sleeping ones. There's nothing in the world more dangerous than sleepwalkers. There's a reason, my friends, those t-shirts say stay woke and Black Lives Matter. Because we've been tiptoeing around, as my good friend Jim Bear Jacobs says, whiteness needs to be innocent. And in that desire for innocence is always the effort to say, well, were there the moments, and it's not a bad impulse, I understand the impulse. Can we talk about the moments where we got this right instead of understanding that every day people die? Whether it's the story of Fort Snelling, and what happened to the Dakota people, or whether it's the story of Black folks in our community, every day people die because of policies, practices, and procedures. Minneapolis police talk about a pattern of practice with regard to policing, but what about the pattern of practice with regard to racial injustice and the ways in which it's infused in all aspects of our community, our society, and culture? It's always predicated on death. We just don't always see it in the stark terms that we were all forced to confront it, with Derek Chauvin staring back into the camera and going, I really don't give a damn about him. But our housing, education, social determinants of health, they all stare back at us and say, we don't give a damn about them.
You know, thank you for saying that. Those words are important. I would also like to put out there that that freeway that came through our community, through my community, it put Black folks and white folks, you know, who we used to live side by side. And it was a time when this community worked together to make things happen. But I will also say, when that freeway went through, we were in a situation where we said, okay, we're going to make this community work. It was on us to make this community work. You know, Central High School was open. You know, I was just talking with Martha out there. My wife, she lived several blocks from where I did before we were married. Didn't even know that. Okay, but I think back. I mean, this is really emotional for me. You know, talking like this about my neighborhood. All right, and I don't think I'm romanticizing. But it did work. It did work. You know, we had our little social clubs. We had our stores. We had Central High School. We had Hosmer Library. We made this place work. And right now I'm getting choked up about it because that freeway went through, the schools closed, our Black Wall Street, 38th Street, the intersection. It was a demise. And then along with progress, you know, folks moved on. When I moved back into my home, right down there on 35th, I'll never forget my dad said to me, what are you moving back into that old neighborhood for? there's some folks out there who knew my dad. But it was a no-brainer. There was no question about the fact that once I moved back to Minneapolis, where I was going to go. And now, believe it or not, there is a little building up. There's a little momentum that's starting to take place. Now, George Floyd might have been the catalyst for that, unfortunately. You have to think about what you were just saying. But I remember those days when we all worked together and we made something happen. We made something happen. And God willing, it'll come back. One of the last things that I'll say is that with all those black folks who were my mentors, who led me, who taught me, there was this one message that always came across to me when we think about black men and death. And I remember them always saying, it's there, but for the grace of God, go I. And I'll never forget that. I'll never forget that. When I step out of my house, I think about who I am. And for sure, when I leave the South Side, I'm thinking about who I am, going into other communities. I shouldn't have had to live my life like that, but I do. But it's for the grace of God, go I.
There was a question over there, Mary Jo. Yeah, right there.
I think we have time for just a couple more. Yeah.
All right. Dr. Williams, you pointed out just how very close we came to many of us just consuming the police report as the official narrative surrounding the murder of George Floyd. And I know that you have done extensive research on the relationship of Minneapolis Police Department, particularly in Black and Indigenous communities. And after George Floyd's murder, we heard promises of reforms from Minneapolis Police Department, both internally as well as external accountability factors. Many of those are being walked back, and I'm just curious your candid assessment, if you had to grade progress or lack of progress for the Minneapolis Police Department in the last 5 years.
It's a hard question because the echoes are great, and I think there are those in this community. I think, unfortunately, language around defund the police obscured a truism about policing, which is that its roots are in policing Black and brown bodies. So in order for us to move from a model of talking about policing to public safety, we'd have to reimagine what policing is and what it's always been. That doesn't mean defund. It means that we'd have to reimagine public safety. It speaks to what happened in 1975 when you have Arthur Cunningham, the head of the NAACP here in Minneapolis, making national headlines when he declares the Minneapolis police have declared war on Blacks and Indians. So this is not a phenomena that exists only in this moment. This is something that's had a long history. Black people have the benefit of being ultra visible in that conversation in a way that Native victims of police violence remain invisible. There are 2 cases now, even though the department is making headway under the state consent decree, Minnesota Department of Human Rights, the case of a gentleman by the name of Mattori and an indigenous woman by the name of Lucier. Most people know about the Mattori case and what happened there, and it's an egregious failure by the MPD. Very few people know about the death of this Native woman and the, disparate accounts that are coming from the medical examiner and the police department. The medical examiner says there are signs of perhaps foul play, and the police department is saying, no, it's a drug overdose. In those moments, there's real fear in this community about whether these reforms will be sufficient to change not only the culture of the department, but also the very raison d'etre of policing as it's presently constituted. You can't there's a way in which we could point to how effective policing is because it has continued to operate like a refrigerator running in the background exactly as intended. It is a well-tuned watch that no matter what you do in order to kind of disrupt that, it always resets and continues on in the way that it was intended to function. And so you need that process of reimagination that comes not with fear, but with some of the exciting things that were happening in 1975 that are interrupted. That was a moment of reform. 74, they had social workers ride along with police officers. The police union pushed back. In 73, after a young man named Randy Sample was dragged down the street by the Minneapolis police, and that was a viral moment in that moment, you had the white community say, we don't want children dragged down the middle of the street like Birmingham. Do something about this. And in that moment, you had conversations about, well, let's help these black children be more respectful. Not, let's help our police be less brutal. 1975, the response is, we need to help officers really engage in transactional analysis, how they address the community, things like honorifics and things. They got 96 hours of police training, 14 hours of transactional analysis. So when Derek Chauvin put his knee on George Floyd's neck, I see the echo of that history, and this is what the police, as we know them, are trained to do. I am a person who feels that Brian O'Hara has done the best that he possibly can under the circumstances. That federal consent decree was absolutely necessary to establish guidelines around constitutional policing, which we now don't have. I would give the department a C, and that's primarily like D-C. Not because I don't want the work to continue, but we're also now facing the possibility for regime change, and that Mayor Frye may be out at the end of this year, and O'Hara may be out at the end of this year. Welcome to Minneapolis in 1969. Welcome to Minneapolis in 1980. Welcome to America. So here we go again. So a long-winded way, Reverend Jacobs, of saying, I see the efforts. I think the problem for us is, will we see the fruit?
Yes, first of all, I am truly excited to be here and to see all of you participate in this conversation. And there's so many points that have been made, starting with Greg talking about having a police officer putting a pistol to your head, knowing how the community was set up. You talked about the 35W development. I'm a street rat from the south side of Chicago, so I have a tremendous commitment to how cities are set up. But what piqued my interest in this article, because I read it from beginning to end, I shared it with colleagues around the country, because it reflected to me something that I experienced in Chicago. And in Chicago, I never understood how the Dan Ryan Expressway was created, and why the Eisenhower was created, and why Lakeshore Drive was created. And because I'm a South Side Chicago guy, I know all about East Chicago. I know about the conversations about people coming to Minneapolis. I've been here 38 years, and being a South Sider from Chicago, I immediately came to the city on a corporate relocation, but I moved to Golden Valley. And because I told the realtor, look, I don't want to move out to Plymouth, Maple Grove, and all. I said, I'm a street rat from Chicago. I love bus fumes, okay? So I want to be close to the community. But the point I want to make is just that the lady who did the mapping prejudice piece, I've been watching that for many years since I've been here, and it led me to read The Color of Law. And when I read The Color of Law, I finally had an aha moment. I thought about how the government was the main curator of all of this, and I started thinking about my life in Chicago. I lived in the projects on the south side, was there for 50 years of my life. I literally chased pigeons on the Dan Ryan Expressway when they were building it. So I started watching all of that stuff happen. I saw the Robert Taylor homes put together. I saw how downtown was put together. I saw how Hyde Park was put together. So my point I want to make, and I'll close, I saw the racial and if you think about 1919 in Chicago, the great race war in Chicago, that was the beginning of it. I mean, with the stockyards and all of that stuff. So it led me to do my research, and I found a book, The Color of Law, and it helped me to understand that the government was behind this major mapping process, not just in Minneapolis, but it's in Chicago, it's in Atlanta, it's in, every major city that you could think of, and it was a great racial divide when they began putting interstate transportation as a key objective. Making revenue and disrupting communities was like small and minute. So if you haven't read that book, I think it will give you some more insight in regards to how the government has really been the curator of this massive national dysfunctionality and also part of the racial divide. Most of the homes that were built in the suburbs were built for the World War II white soldiers. My father was a World War II soldier and never had a chance to buy a house. My mother died at 100, didn't have a house. So I took a look at this book and I started reading in between the lines how they came up with the projects.
Right.
Had you ever thought about that? Who in the world would come up with an idea for a 17-floor building, okay, with 10 apartments on the floor and put 4 of them in a square city block? So I'm just saying, the devil's in the details, and there's a lot of things that are going on right now in how things are being planned out for us as a society, and it's whack. I mean, it's really, not allowing us, Greg, to have that cumulative, collaborative effort. It's these constant dividers, and when you talked about breathing, I totally understand that, because I'm at a point in my life now where I think I can breathe, from the perspective that I don't care. I mean, I just don't care. I mean, my focus is so narrow now that it's me, mine, I'm taking care of my family the best way I can, but the rest of the stuff, I'm just convinced, and I get so discouraged because it is out of whack, okay? I'm a grandfather. I'm concerned about my grandkids being able to have a future. So there's just a lot of connections that you made. I appreciate the forum. Like Ralph says, I think this is an excellent forum for pulling this together. Greg, I haven't seen you in years, but I appreciate your story, and I've got chapters that I could add to your comments. So thank you very much.
I want to come over and collect some of those chapters from you.
I made a note of that. I saw some people making a note of that. The Color of Law, something to read, and Ralph Crowder's film coming up. Keep an eye out for that.
Ralph, are you screening anywhere?
Oh, okay.
In the next couple of weeks that people can see?
Oh, New York.
Yeah. It's excellent.
Okay, we'll keep an eye out for that.
All right.
I think we have one more question.
Yes.
Sorry.
The name of his show, documentary.
You can just Google it. It's called The Lost Negroes of North America. The Lost Negroes of North America.
All right.
Thank you.
So thank you all. I want to thank you all for putting this together. This is very enlightening in some respect, but also confirming in a much more, far greater than enlightening. It's confirming of something that we already know, particularly Black folks. This is another day in America for us. So I want to say 2 things. One is my company actually was hired by the city of Minneapolis. 2021, we led up the initial community engagement for the future of George Floyd Square, 38th in Chicago. We held several community meetings, many of them here once a month, every 3rd Monday of the month, 2021 to 2023, called Learning Tables. We brought the community together to really help create a plan for the future of George Floyd Square with regard to the streets, the transportation, the memorial, what's going to happen with the gas station and so forth, right? And at the end of our engagement, toward the end of our engagement, the group of individuals that we brought together to help inform the city about what should take place facilitated a community-driven survey in which we hired Cura to come and help create that survey, and we did it. The survey was conducted online, as well as we hired the People's Canvass to do a door knocking portion of the survey. And and I just want to say this, and I'm not going to get into all the details of the survey, and I can get into you all if you want a copy of the survey, but one of the things that stood out that came to us when we asked the question of what you want to see happen with the People's Way, the gas station that's there. Some responses that we have, and there was enough response that we had to report it. It wasn't just one or two. Somebody said, or some individual said that a prison should be erected at the gas station, where the gas station is sitting now.
A prison?
There should be a prison there. These were some of the responses that we got when we asked the question about what should happen with the gas station there at 38th in Chicago. So I just wanted to share that with you. The second thing I want to share with you is all of this, to me, is held together, the substratum of everything that we're facing, everything that's happened in America and still continues to happen in America, and something needs to be done to, if something needs to be done to change it, we need to really look at this, right? How many of you all remember and familiar with Dred Scott decision, right? And those of you who are not familiar with Dred Scott, was a slave, and at that time in the South was still holding slaves. The North had at that time abolished slavery, and the law was that if a slave travels to the North, then he is free. You don't have to be slave anymore, right? And so he came here to Fort Snelling with his slave master, fought for his freedom, right? But the judge in the decision, the Supreme Court Justice William Taney, said one thing. He said this, and this statement has never been debunked. It has never been debunked. It's never been denied. But he said, blacks have no rights that whites are bound to respect. Blacks have no rights that whites are bound to respect. He said that in his decision to deny Dred Scott of his freedom. That has been the substratum that holds all of this together. That has been the every decision, every law, every disparity is predicated upon that blacks have no rights that whites are bound to respect. And until we deal with that in the minds of even all of us, right? Particularly white folks who hold it together, people who subscribe to this false ideology of white supremacy, because it is a false ideology. It's not real. It's a false ideology. Black people are figments of your imagination, right? And it is a form of psychosis, right? That continues to hold this thing together. And until we deal with that, we're going to have more George Floyds. Matter of fact, we've had more George Floyds. It's just that they don't cover it anymore. So Star Tribune, I'm going to challenge you to begin to cover the stories correctly. You're doing all of this, but I'm asking you to continue to cover the stories correctly, to say what it is, to call it out, to not just jump on, because you have no excuse. I've been in Minneapolis. My wife and I, we moved here in 1990 from the south side of Chicago, and we were working with youth on the south side of Chicago, and we moved here in 1990. And nothing has changed. I could go back to Tysel Nelson. I can go back to the two Asian kids that were murdered by police officers. I can go back to Smalley and Weiss. I can go back to many accounts of police brutality against our people, and continue. The Star Tribune continues to distort the true story of what happened in those cases, continue to do that. So I just want to say this. Until we deal with the idea of this false notion that blacks have no rights that whites are bound to respect, we're going to continue to have George Floyd's, we're going to continue to have this anti-black violence enacted against black and brown bodies. So thank you.
Thank you.
I just have to add to that very quickly, though. People like to quote that part of the Taney decision, and it's important. But I just want to remind us as Minnesotans that long before the Supreme Court got that case, as Jim Bear Jacobs points out in the Sacred Sites Tour, Scott's slave master was still comfortable bringing him here because Minnesota was a popular vacation spot for Southerners who bought their slaves in spite of the law. So even before Taney named it and wrote it into law, it was this expectation that may be what the law says, but I take my property where I want to go because I'm the only one that matters in this equation. I think, we're in a moment now where everything's being adjudicated, but I think your larger point is something that Donna Trice spoke to in terms of talking about the epigenetic harm that manifests in communities of color. Wounds produce narratives. And when W. Gertrude Brown says, which is the part I wish they had played of her speech, Black people don't get a ghost of a chance. But look what Black people produce with just the ghost. Yeah. Rondo, the old South Side. Yeah. So if you're looking for hope, don't look for hope in what can we do to put some bones around that spirit to allow it to continue to thrive, to learn from that history in ways that elevate, to recognize what we've done in spite of, and to then, in the same way that you talked about, which I think is very important, lean into that language and say, so what if, imagine a world in which not only that decision wasn't possible, but the expectation that the law would support me in my denial of your humanity for all of us. Yeah. Could be really powerful.
Thank you. We do need to bring it to a close, even though this is terrific. I need to thank the people behind the program tonight. That includes everyone on the stage: Kirsten Delegard, Greg McMore, Uhuru Williams, Greg D'Onofrio, and Eric Roper. I also want to thank all the people you don't see, but who made this happen. Their names are up there on the screen. I was told not to read them because it would take too long. Also, thank you to our sponsors, including the Racial Justice Initiative at St. Thomas University, where Uhuru works, and also the Minnesota Council of Churches, where Jim Bear Jacobs works. If you haven't listened to the podcast, Ghost of a Chance, which most of you have, thank you, but if you haven't, you can still find it on any of your favorite podcast apps. Just search for Ghost of a Chance. And finally, a community group based here in the Old South Side, has launched a GoFundMe to raise money for a headstone for Clementine Robinson. Eric found her will where she said she very much wanted a headstone, but there isn't one up in Crystal Lake Cemetery. So some of the money will go, toward the gravestone, and then some of that will also go to other commemorations of the Old South Side. There's a QR code up here, and you can donate to the GoFundMe. Throw $5 up there.
And there's a short URL, bit.ly/Robinson Memorial. And so, and some of that relates to some of the work Greg's doing, and you can read more about it at the GoFundMe.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for being a part of this. Thank you everyone up here, and have a good night. There are cookies in the hallway outside. Enjoy.